Welcome. This is Mike Grigsby with MW Griggs Consulting, and thank you for joining us on the Readiness Gap. Today, I am very excited about the topic that we're going to talk about. This is actually part 2 of the Hyper-Converged city. Today, we're going to be talking about everything, everywhere, all at once. If you remember the 2022 movie, the protagonist had all of this stuff happening to her at one time. She had to defend off the universe. It was all kinds of things happening, and she was in the middle of a tax audit, right? There was the mundane thing that she had to get done while defending the world, and I'll tell you, that doesn't seem like futuristic anymore. That seems like a regular Tuesday at City Hall now for a lot of city leaders. So we're going to talk about this. I am excited to bring up my good friend Jen Tifft, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the City of Syracuse. And Jen brings a really interesting perspective. Working at the municipal level, she is in the quote-unquote inner circle, or at least the inner decision-making circles of what happens at the city, and she gets to put her hand on a lot of different things that are going on across the city. So Jen's perspective is really going to give us insight into the real challenges that mayors and mayor offices and city managers and city manager offices are facing as we look at technology that's accelerating and accelerating and accelerating and accelerating. How do we take this all in? So we are going to get rolling in here. Jen, welcome. Thank you for being on the show. It is so good to have you. I'm glad we got a chance to catch up in Raleigh a few weeks ago. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, for having me. This is exciting.
No. Jen, I mentioned already that you're the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the City of Syracuse. Give us a little bit of background about what that means and kind of the purview that you have that you're responsible for, and certainly the things that you get to see coming across your desk.
Yeah, so Mike, I appreciate the question. I think the title is maybe a little ambiguous. And essentially, you know, I get to work on a lot of different types of projects, which is really exciting for me. I think, you know, I've always kind of been more of a generalist in kind of my approach to things, and I'm a former consultant as well, and so I think most folks that have done consulting for any amount of time, maybe including yourself, really like the variety and, the sort of the diversity that those types of roles afford. And so in many ways, I'm kind of, part internal consultant to the city, but I also lead the implementation of a lot of projects. But my work really does take a pretty wide berth. And, obviously it is in support of the mayor's strategy. And so as those strategic priorities are identified, I certainly get to play a role in how actual projects or initiatives, get deployed. I work on everything from, municipal broadband deployment, like actual deployment of physical infrastructure and digital inclusion programming, to frankly to internal sort of process optimization work to make our some of our city functions a little bit more responsive to our constituents, to embed better practices or standardize processes, all important, consultancy buzzwords, but really has very important, benefits, I think, for constituents. Because whether we're talking about process or technology, frankly, like there are just a lot of opportunities to, I think, streamline and incorporate better practices. Frankly, like this is what all industries are doing, but government does sort of have a little bit of an institutional lag, because of some of our very intentional governance requirements, and so so we're always looking for ways as good stewards of financial resources and advocates for our communities. Like, we're always looking for ways just to improve the way we do stuff. Kind of that proverbial doing more with less. Like, local governments are always in that position. That's not going to change anytime soon. So, we really look for ways to do that pretty consistently, because it obviously does impact the city's bottom line, but it really impacts the quality and quantity of services we can provide for people.
Yeah, that's good. The city of Syracuse is one of the larger cities in the state of New York, and just for the audience, help people understand who and where, more importantly, where Syracuse is, because New York is kind of like California. Everybody thinks every city is close to Los Angeles in California, and everybody thinks every city is close to New York City in New York.
Right,
help the audience understand where Syracuse is and kind of what the dynamics are in the city.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and I'm always looking for opportunities to sort of level set on kind of the realities of being in a state like New York. So New York is geographically a very, very large state. I think unless you're looking on the map or unless you're from New York State, like you probably don't necessarily realize or appreciate that. So, New York from, end to end, if you're looking at a map, like east-west, with obviously New York City being on the East Coast, as an island, like literally in the Atlantic, to Buffalo, which is the westernmost, kind of major city in the state. It's like a 8 or 9 hour drive in a car, right? I should know the mileage maybe, but I don't.
Right.
But regardless, like it takes as long to drive from Buffalo to New York City as it does to drive from Buffalo to Chicago. I know this because I grew up in Buffalo and I went to college in Chicago, so I frequently would have to do that, and I very rarely got to go to New York City as a kid because it was really not that close. But Syracuse is right in the middle of the state. So if you're looking at a map and you kind of put your finger in the centermost point, both longitudinally and latitudinally, Syracuse is like smack in the middle. So it is the fifth largest city in the state of New York. It's about 150,000 residents in a much larger region. Very, very densely populated urban location, sort of typical northeastern, approach to urban density. But, in a lot of our cities outside of New York City, in the state of New York, you have a dense urban core, but you very quickly get to rural communities once you go maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes outside of that urban core. You've sort of bypassed suburbs at that point, and you are truly in a rural area. So, our county is mostly rural, with obviously an urban center, and so it's a really like interesting place to be. Culturally and socially, we have a lot of dynamics where we do have we sort of have the best of all worlds when it comes to geographic diversity and natural diversity. But we also have, pretty wide disparities in things like income and poverty, and some of those metrics that really are important to city leaders and managers. And so it is a lovely place to be. Very, a few hours drive to places like New York City or Boston, or even like Philadelphia from Syracuse because of where we're located. But yeah, also, some more unique challenges just given, kind of the demographics of the region.
I appreciate the population explanation for Syracuse, because at 150,000 and probably we'll go to maybe even 250,000 for the metropolitan service area there. there are more of those types of cities in the U.S. than there are the New York cities, the Los Angeles, the Atlantas, the Chicagos, etc. And I think the reason I bring that up is I think a lot of people in the audience are going to kind of, it'll resonate more what you're saying as they look at their city. And certainly, Syracuse has a big enough footprint and certainly a big enough reputation that things that you are doing, achievements that you're making in Syracuse can scale up or scale down, and people around the country will be able to recognize applicability for their individual or their respective locale. So this is, as I said at the start, this is part 2 of a conversation that was started last month around the hyper-converged city. And where that term came from is, as I've looked across the country and even across the globe, cities are seeing a rapid merging of information technology, IT, and operation technology, OT. And as those two things come together, because almost, and this is kind of the phrase that I've started kind of speaking out about this, is virtually every physical asset within a city now has a digital heartbeat. There is some element that is tracking, managing, or extracting some level of data or intelligence out of it. And your water sensor is no longer just a mechanical valve, right? It now has intelligence and data that it is communicating, not just back to the water department, but in some cases, and certainly we'll see this more as we progress, it's communicating information to the broad spectrum of all departments within the city. This is a real challenge because as our city leaders, mayors, city managers, department heads, even city councilors, elected officials, they stepped into public administration with the idea of balancing the budget or fixing schools or making, improving the citizen satisfaction surveys and things along those lines. Now they are effectively co-CTOs, right? They are managing era-defining decisions around perpetual software contracts, around data sovereignty, or around cybersecurity that they probably had no recollection of, no visibility into, no experience with, and certainly not at the scale that they do stepping into these roles. Talk a little bit, I know you feel this, certainly with the projects that you're managing. What is the reality of that, oh my gosh, I'm a co-CTO now, when that hits those city leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I do think in some ways, while I generally agree, I think, with the way you've sort of framed this, I do think in many ways some of our existing, functions and frankly just our governance and planning functions are more or less equipped to help us manage this transition as you're describing it. And what I mean by that is, we are as planners, right? Like city planners at the end of the day, because everyone who's in city administration or operations, essentially like a big part of the job is planning and then obviously, implementing those plans. That planning activity, it really can and should, and it has for some time absorbed the realities of planning for IT, both hardware and software, infrastructure, like network infrastructure, and all of the related assets and capabilities that cities, need either in-house or they need to outsource. And so at the end of the day, like, to me, it's really about kind of planning, education, and return on investment analysis. And so, from a planning perspective, we have an annual city budget cycle. We have multi-year capital improvement planning cycles. Both of those get updated annually, even if we're talking about the multi-year capital improvement plan. And we use those processes and those formal documents to essentially, give a forecast and, share ultimately our IT portfolio plans with various stakeholders. And so, we do need to think about on an annual basis, like what we need from an IT perspective, and our operational folks, really need to obviously drive that conversation because, we want the technology to follow the business need, right, or the constituent need from the perspective of a city. And so the operational folks, are really saying we're trying to serve this many more people with this type of service, or, we have to, upgrade this part of our water system, to use a water example, since you mentioned water sensors, and what are all of the things we need to do that from a people, process, and technology perspective. And that gets reflected from a resourcing point of view in those budgetary plans. And frankly, we use a series of very public meetings, to share that information with elected leaders like city council, but frankly, to also, be transparent, share that information with our constituents, and to enable, feedback as well from those different stakeholders. And so, while we are seeing this, really shift as you're describing it, where, operational technology, is really ruling the day in many ways, or being seen as much more ubiquitous and sort of omnipresent.
Right.
Just given all of the things that we're frankly looking to technology to do for us, especially related to automating certain things or enabling better workflows and things like that. At the end of the day, we can still rely on some of those pretty well-known and trusted planning activities and the educational activities that, run alongside them, to kind of make sure all of our stakeholders are not only understanding what opportunities exist related to technology, but really translating those into the actual benefits that, will accrue to not just, city staff who, are relying on technology to do their jobs, but frankly, translating that into a return on investment for the constituents themselves.
Yeah.
And that's probably the piece that of everything, right, that is kind of the trickiest for a lot of government managers, to really get a handle on is kind of the calculations around return on investment, both truly from a financial perspective, but in terms of social and political investment as well.
Yeah, you mentioned it just a moment ago, though, and I think this is what you're talking about, right? Is the tech, whether that's on the IT side or the OT side, really needs to follow the business mission or the resident mission.
Right.
Are you finding tension? Are there challenges in that? Is this kind of an aha moment, like we didn't think about that before, or how does that play out with cities? As I guess Syracuse, but I know you also communicate with other cities. How are you seeing that tension between we need to get this done versus that's not really satisfying the mission, or so to speak? Talk about that a little bit, because I think it goes back to the ROI side of it too.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I do think, just to underscore that a little bit more, we do see a lot more, I think, questions and concerns popping up really related to the value of, technology, especially on the software side. I think our Common Council, which is what we call our city council here in Syracuse, but legislators as well as mayors, city managers, folks who are really leading, right? Like, they are trying to appreciate when we see, and present, frankly, rising costs associated with software, which is happening more now, frankly, just because of the shift in how technology is delivered, to everyone, not just cities, right? Because this is true, I think, in many industries. But, at the end of the day, everyone's trying to understand and justify what they perceive as kind of rising costs associated with software, or with software development. But in reality, I think those costs are offsetting other types of costs that we would have previously had, right? And so,
for sure.
Again, I think to me, the hard part isn't necessarily the evaluation of the technology itself or the understanding of how it fits in and supports our operations. And, it's not even necessarily really on the calculus around the ROI, although that is, I will admit, that is kind of a challenge. But I think in communicating and educating various types of stakeholders who are going to have different levels of understanding of these things, that I think is really the important nut to crack, because we do really need our stakeholders to buy in and to understand the value of these things. We obviously need them to approve plans and to allocate budget for them. So we need folks to truly be on board and to understand the rationale behind those things. And I do think people do genuinely want to understand the relationship between what a particular type of technology costs and actual results for people. So I think if we get better about telling those stories, making it really real, and frankly, like, putting that information in different types of, formats, we will get there, and we'll see a lot more buy-in in the process. But I do think, like, that relationship, frankly, between, like, bottom line in the budget year after year and results, right? Like,
it's so challenging.
It is, but it really is no different. Like, again, public budgeting, there's always an understanding within managing public organizations like cities, that when you put your budget together, it's a very public document, a public process, but you do generally have to say for every dollar that's in there, right? Like, what are you producing? And so cities, counties, states, et cetera, like, they will have, for every budget line, whether it's technology related, whether it's, human resources related, we have to share the metrics or the operational indicators, right? What we're expecting to use those resources for. And so, again, that process exists. We do need to be better because of some of the changing landscape in the technology sector right now. Like, we need to get better about, being realistic, but being as specific as we can be about the results of technology. Because I do think, people generally understand, right? Like, you need a staff of X many parks and rec employees to put on Y number of community events, or to run certain recreation programs, to keep 8 pools open, or whatever the outcome indicators are, right? We need to be just as good about saying, like, it also takes these softwares to support
that's
those
such an
functions.
important point. Yeah. That is such an important point because I'll rewind the tape back to when I first stepped into public service, public sector environment. That was 2005, and technology was an option. Technology was truly a support function that was like, if you needed it or if you were interested in it, you could leverage these things. And we had some things on file.
Yeah.
But there was always the fallback of you could do the paper process or you could do the manual process or things along those lines. And that as an option has by and large gone away. I mean, technology really is the substrate of everything that we're doing, right? There was a moment where we went from kind of, we had this analog process, then we digitized everything, right? Now you got a PDF that you had to fill out, put a stamp on it, lick the envelope and send it out. Now we're truly digital, meaning it's digital first, it's digital in the middle, it's digital all the way through its life cycle. And it really does change the dynamics of how we interact with this. You said something just a minute ago, and I wanted to kind of take a little deeper dive on that, was this notion of adoption, right? When everything everywhere is connected all at once, there is a real bona fide fatigue that sets in at the leadership level, at the practitioner level, at the residential level. There's a real fatigue that sets in to adopt this. How do you, because I know you get a chance to see, not only are you working on the strategic side, but you also get to put your hands on the innovative side. Like, here's some innovation things that we're trying to do and spin it around. So it's kind of a two-part question. One, how do you in your role think of innovative things? How do you kind of triage innovation? But then also, how are you helping the city, the city employees, but the city as residents also adopt all these new things coming down the pipe?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think in part because my role in orientation, it does tend to be a little bit outside of just day-to-day city operations. So while I do support, a lot of initiatives that ultimately, are about improving city operations, most of my work, I would say, is actually about thinking about how the city can and should be an enabler for the community to take advantage of opportunities as it relates to technology in this instance, for example. And so, when we really first started to look at it in our last mayoral administration, for example, like issues related to poverty, which is a really important problem for us to solve and to really make some tangible advances in, lowering our poverty rate, especially in certain parts of the city where it's just been very concentrated. We actually use some data, because that's a good thing to do, data-driven decisions. So we looked at, what were some of the highest correlating factors to poverty, especially, really concentrated poverty in specific census blocks or census tracts. And we actually found that a lack of home internet access was one of the highest correlated factors to that issue. At the time, the city wasn't doing anything to help community members connect to the internet. I don't think we fully appreciated, while there were certainly at that point, data and studies that indicated we had a big digital divide in Syracuse. It was, looking at the data in that way that really enabled us to very directly tie those things together. And shortly after we did that, really within a matter of probably 6 months or so, the pandemic hit. And then, digital access and digital inclusion, really became so paramount, right? Just so not even a question, right? And so So we kind of use that opportunity, frankly, to kind of say, if we could access resources that the city's never had access to really make investments in digital infrastructure that would directly support the community itself, what would we do? And we decided, to launch a municipal broadband program. But as we evaluated that as an option, because certainly there are other interventions you could take as a city, to help connect residents, to internet. But we took that step because we also recognized as a city we really didn't have a large investment in digital infrastructure, even to support city operations. So we did very basic, I think, networking things, just kind of standard, types of investments in hardware, obviously, software, but we didn't have like a fiber ring in the city, for example. We didn't have fiber connected to our firehouses or some of those other things, which frankly a lot of other communities had. And so we kind of used the need that we identified in the community as the catalyst. But frankly, we said, like, if we're going to do this and do this the right way, we're going to do it in a way from an ROI perspective where, we can get the biggest bang for the investment, and we're going to leverage resources that are available for, internet connectivity, community internet connectivity, but that same infrastructure, since we're going to make the investment, we're going to maintain it, we should make sure as we design that network, like that city buildings and anchor institutions are connected to it, and to make sure that we can leverage some of those same investments for other assets that the city was interested in, for municipal operations. A lot of public safety assets, for example, with our cops cameras and other technologies as well that, frankly, historically we just, kind of purchased, internet plans to support those connected data devices. But at the same time, like, we're kind of taking this bold step to invest in, advanced telecommunications capability from a digital infrastructure perspective. And so these are the things that, they afford us the opportunity to create this really robust roadmap that says over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to invest in this type of digital infrastructure, and it's going to serve all these different purposes, right? It's going to allow us to connect people in their homes to the internet affordably. It's going to allow us to connect these types of city buildings, which will then, be directly connected to fiber and be able to have that much more of an impact in terms of their operational capacity for the neighborhoods that they are directly serving. And so that's like one example. But really, I think it's a good one because it does sort of demonstrate how, as we're thinking about making certain investments in digital capabilities, there are real community-facing use cases, as well as, maybe use cases that an average resident would never see or know or feel per se. And so, I think being able to think and plan holistically around those things, ultimately it is what cities are, I think, the opportunity that's before us, but also there are certainly a lot of challenges and constraints to doing that.
When you're rolling that out, because I think what you're saying is, you're using that as that use case as an example to synthesize how you might, drive adoption for something else. What happens when residents push back? I know certainly, you know, at my time as a municipal CIO, we always had to kind of gauge, you know, what's the right threshold? If it's 98% adoption, is it 90% adoption? Is it 75% adoption? How do you see today in 2026, how are you gauging what that residential pushback looks like, or maybe even it's not active pushback, it's just laggards, right? People who either don't have access to it or are choosing not to do that. How do you work through those kind of challenges?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a little different depending on, you know, what it is, certainly, and a lot of the things that we do, you know, kind of broadband aside, because that's sort of a little bit of a different animal since it's essentially a commercial market, and we're, you know, we are one option. Right. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of our departmental technologies, you know, those are really intended to be the kind of the primary interface for a resident in the city and that function. So, you know, we have online payment tools, obviously, for certain types of, you know, city services for which fees are required. And so if you want that type of service, like, that's your only option, right? You have to use the service. And now that we've kind of digitized some of those things and created more of those types of self-service functionalities, right? Like, we can, you know, measure and really gauge how many people are using them versus options, you know, still like coming in person to one of the, you know, service locations, for example. So we did a really big deployment. I think we're actually still technically in the process of doing it with a lot of our permitting and licensing functions. And so, you know, we've not only digitized all of those things, but we have created a self-service portal for applying for most types of permits, for example. And on the commercial, you know, building permit side of things, like, we've seen a huge adoption, which, you know, was sort of anticipated because one of the big drivers or reasons for us, you know, moving into a very digital platform for that was, you know, overwhelming request by those commercial developers for those tools. You know, I think where there's still opportunity for improvement, and I think we're still actually digitizing some of the specific types of forms, is around some of the more residential permitting and like small business licensing related stuff that we do, which obviously impacts like a much larger set of constituents. But if you're someone who's, you know, maybe upgrading your deck at your house, or, you know, adding an addition, something like that, like, you need to go through the permitting process. You know, you may or may not know that the city has an online function. We may not necessarily have every single form that you need to fill out available online yet. So that's where, you know, I think we actively try to manage, you know, through the deployments and post-deployment, you know, feedback from constituents, whether that's feedback from people who are using the tools or feedback from people who, because, you know, we still have a permit office that you can physically go to, you know, to ask questions, fill out forms, if you don't want to use the online process. And so, yeah, there are mechanisms, both digital and analog, for, I think, collecting that feedback, understanding where there's still opportunities to make improvements. But now we can also measure and really quantify, like, especially where we've seen, you know, larger adoption at scale for some of our commercial permits, for example. Like, we know how much time that saves us. We have a way to quantify that now that we do have, you know, a robust data solution in place. And so that data is now available to, you know, to our legislators, for example, and to constituents. So just over the last few years, we've been able to really say, you know, there's been a X percent increase in the number of commercial permits we've issued, that correlates to an actual revenue number for the city associated with those permits. And so it's really like that example, I think, is a really good one, because, and not everything we all do from a digital optimization perspective has a direct result in municipal revenue, but this is one that does, and that is so critical for municipalities of all sizes at this point. Everyone post ARPA, right, is in a pretty challenging budget environment, to say the least. Our city has a structural deficit. Many do. There's probably fewer that don't have a structural municipal deficit than do, frankly. And so at the end of the day, right, we're all looking for new ways from an innovation perspective to either grow revenue streams that exist or create new revenue streams. And so, on the permitting side, like, the bigger volume you can do means the more you're taking in on an annual basis. And when you can quantify that and share that data with decision makers, that becomes that much easier for folks to make decisions to allocate resources to maintain those technologies, because again, you're tying it to the city's bottom line, which in turn allows us to continue to serve the people who are voting for the people who are making the decision.
No, very, very, very true. I guess that's the $1 million question, right? Or the multi-million dollar question is, how do we pay for all of this? Right. We know, you talk about a structural deficit. We know that we have physical assets that are at end of life, that were put in the 50s and the 40s and the 60s, right? That they're at end of life, and we've got to modernize that. That's become kind of a catchphrase now. What's the city's modernization plan? Right. You can't do all of this at one time. I know in a previous episode we tackled technical debt and kind of legacy systems, right? When you look at digital infrastructure, it is also at end of life and needing to be modernized just the same. How does a city begin to prioritize where those dollars go? Because it's a finite budget, right? You only have X number of dollars that you can spend to modernize one or two systems each year. And though it may be a grand idea and even a very beneficial idea, it may not be its time yet. It may be on the 2030 plan, not the 2026 plan. Right. How do cities kind of prioritize what gets updated or what projects they need to tackle? Yeah. So again, I go back to like one of my earlier comments. Like it's really about like planning, education, and doing the ROI analysis. So. So again, like from a planning perspective, we already have mechanisms, and most folks who are, leading city departments or, within city leadership teams, right? Like we are, trained in annual budget planning and multi-year capital improvement planning. And so, we need to identify where digital assets, technology is aging out, just like we do for, a trash truck or, a police vehicle, like whatever the case may be, or frankly, like, a major road reconstruction project, like, we know, like we updated that road or we repaved it 10 years ago. So it's probably time to repave it again. If not sooner in places like Syracuse because of all of our snow. But regardless, whatever the typical lifespan is for the asset, right? And IT is no different. And we've been in the habit, of doing this. I think, the IT area is becoming more challenged just because there's so many more options. The pace of innovation in the tech sector changes. Correct. So, from a long-term planning perspective, options that you have at your disposal today, those might be outdated
2 years from now or 3 years from now, as opposed to 5 to 10 years from now, which was maybe more of the past experience. So, but again, we do the long range planning annually. So you have like a 5-year capital plan, for instance. You're going to update that capital plan every year. And so the 5-year, cycle shifts out 1 year every year. But that's really the opportunity to do cross-departmental prioritization, really to say, we know we have to improve this set of roads. We have to, update this portion of the city's fleet of vehicles. We have to, make capital investments in our, maybe some of our facilities, right? Like the whole laundry list of investments that we need to make. Technology is one vertical that's in that plan. But then city leaders look at it and say, okay, we know we've got a budget target of X from an operating perspective and another target of Y from a capital perspective in a given year, what are the highest priorities? And it does go back to sort of the return on investment analysis that needs to happen for all of those things. I mean, things are end of life or approaching end of life, whether it's a road that needs repaving or a technology that needs to be modernized. Like the opportunity cost of not doing it in a given year, it is going to have certain consequences. That's a part of the analysis, right? Like, so if we defer this decision for another year, what are the likely scenarios? And sometimes that helps to,
it's good. Yeah.
To prioritize. But what is the return on that investment, right? If we can modernize, frankly, a legacy system that carries, really crazy expenses, frankly, on an annual basis because, maybe the underlying technology is outdated. We still have COBOL systems. Yeah. So, the cost of maintaining that system is way more on an annual basis. Plus, if it's an internal system, it's hosted on a server, right? Servers have ends of life. Like, there are all of these costs outside of, maybe the software cost per se. In that example, it might cost us however much, a few $1 million, what have you, depending on the type of system to do an upgrade, let's say. But it allows us to retire certain legacy, very expensive,
for sure,
components that we can then take off of our book. And so all of that stuff can be modeled. It can be, quantified year over year. And I think that's really what we need to be rigorous about, making sure we do each and every time. So we have the data ultimately that, the mayor needs when she's putting her budget proposal together, but that, also the legislators need when they are ultimately trying to make a decision on, how to vote for that budget. And so, I mean, I do think, planning, making sure everyone is educated on what those plans mean and what the trade-offs are, and then, really making sure we have done actual analysis of the investment and the return on that investment. Like, that's really, I think, how we're trying to approach this. I
think it's important. First of all, thank you for acknowledging that you're trying to. There's still an effort involved, right?
Yeah,
we haven't figured this out,
and I
think that's important.
Process.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important, right? I had a conversation just the other day, and I was explaining to people that we have these kind of archaic systems in place that we're just frustrated with, we're opining where they came from and so forth, and how do we get rid of them? We have to stop pointing the finger because those systems were put in place because that's the only thing we had at the time.
Correct.
And it was probably cutting edge at that, right? Maybe if we want if we want to throw shade on anything, it's we didn't progress as fast as everything else did. But the reality is that we're still learning how to do this thing called quote unquote smart cities. And not that that's the end all be all, but we are learning how to do it. You said it just a moment ago. We now have to go rigorously through that data that we have, because not only do we have more data, but we have more access to crunching through that data now. So there's an onus and a responsibility that we've got to go through that to figure out how best to move forward. And we should only try to move forward to the degree that we know how to move forward, right? We can't take 10 steps when we only know how to take one step. So it's important. We have sped through our time. I can't believe this. We're already at the hour. But this is a great conversation, and I know that as more city managers, city leaders, city mayors, etc., are really grappling with what this technology acceleration is doing. I think one thing is really important, and again, my background as a former public sector CIO, I try to communicate this as best I could and champion this as much as I could, but we have to come to the realization, and I think you alluded to this earlier, that digital infrastructure is as essential as physical infrastructure. We have roadways because it makes life inside the city easier. We have parks because it makes life inside life inside the city more experiential, right? We have digital infrastructure to facilitate a lot of what's happening in the city. It's a natural thing. It's a necessary thing. No longer is it an optional thing. And we've got to give it the kind of care and feeding and love that it desires. And it comes at a cost. So we have to, I say this not for the city leaders as much as to say for the residents. You have to understand that is going to come at a cost. If you want the convenience of what you get with Amazon, that's going to come at a cost from Anytown, USA. So one last question that I have for you, and I think you and I have talked about this recently, but as you're looking at this, what has been one of the greatest things that you've been a part of at your time at Syracuse, and what's your hope for what cities look like, we'll call it 2030 and beyond?
So there's a lot of things, honestly, that I'm really proud of, super excited by. I think when I pivoted into public service, I wasn't sure how long I would stay, and it's, almost 8 years later. And in part it's because we did have a really bold vision in the last administration, and I think that vision is carried forward into our current administration under Mayor Owens. But at the end of the day, I think there was this recognition, which was sort of one of our primary economic development strategies, that as our larger world and society move into a fourth industrial revolution, which is all about a much more digitally connected and innovation focused industrial footprint, right? Like at the end of the day, whether that's us as a city, as one enterprise in that ecosystem, or any of our residents who are, in the workforce now or will be in the workforce 10, 20, 30 years from now, we need to be competitive and to enable everyone in our city, in particular folks who historically have been left out of opportunities from an economic perspective, right? We need everyone to kind of come along and have opportunity in that fourth industrial revolution. And so, the city's role can, and we felt strongly should be, as an advocate, a catalyst, an investor in the digital infrastructure that enables that fourth industrial revolution. And so when it came time to make decisions about, launching a municipal broadband program, it was easier because it aligned so obviously with that core strategy, which we called the Syracuse Surge. And again, that strategy enabled us to, frankly, to lay out a set of initiatives that were pretty broad. Some of them were technology initiatives focused on making investments in digital infrastructure. Some of it focused on, digital empowerment programming, so getting folks, much more adept at, using technology, providing opportunities if folks wanted to pivot or get upskilled and change careers into more of a technology type of a career. We created training and certification programs for all of that. We actually built a STEAM high school, which is amazing, but it's the first of its kind, high school for teenagers. It's, a City of Syracuse public high school, but it's actually a high school that folks all across our central New York region can attend. And so it's starting to give students from a much larger, set of backgrounds, right, an opportunity to mix with each other, to learn from each other, and really to build very future-proof, skills in things like data analytics and semiconductor manufacturing, like really cutting-edge stuff. And so, we took this very holistic approach, and again, we kind of teed up, a glide path that expands well beyond the last administration. It creates a lot of opportunity for us under the Owens administration, to continue with a lot of those types of initiatives, which at the end of the day, they're about creating opportunity for not just the city as a municipality, but really more for our residents. But I think recognizing like the city can and should be a catalyst for those opportunities. In addition to, obviously, we have to keep the streets paved. We have to, keep the trash collected. Like, we have to do the core mission of a city government. But we have a much bigger opportunity in front of us and a much larger role to play in things like reducing our poverty rate, making sure, a much higher percentage of kids graduate high school, all of those important things that make a community, a better place to live, that, enable everyone to thrive in that community. We're kind of there for all of that. And I think that's what I've sort of been most inspired by. So it's a cool time, I think, to be in local government in Syracuse.
Well, in Syracuse, and anecdotally speaking, Syracuse is really in such a strong position right now, going from Mayor Walsh to Mayor Owens, right? Not every city gets to truly pass the baton and take an amplifying effect to it. Right. And take advantage of it while you can, because that is such a strong position for a city to be in. Because I've said this jokingly for years, like the antidote to momentum is a change of administration, right? And
it can be, that's for sure.
Fortunately, Syracuse is not having to deal with that, so that's a very strong position. Jen, thank you so much for your time. Your voice and your insights are so beneficial to this topic, and certainly the topic. I was talking about the readiness gap, right? We're needing to narrow that. I don't know that we'll close it, but we're needing to narrow that readiness gap, and your contributions to that topic are so beneficial. So thank you, my friend, for being here.
You.
And as always, I love getting together with you, and maybe we'll have you back on the show at some other point.
Yeah, let me know. Always happy to. This was really great. Like so many important things for all of us to, I think, consider. But appreciate you organizing the conversation.